The mid-July sun beat down on the sprawling concrete expanse of the National Armor Museum's outdoor parade ground with a relentless, baking intensity that turned the air into a shimmering curtain of heat haze, distorting the sharp angles of the armored vehicles lined up for the annual Legends of Steel exhibition. And amidst the roaring crowd of thousands, the smell of unburnt diesel fuel, and the frantic shouting of active-duty tank crews trying to wrestle history into submission. An elderly man in a faded red work shirt and baggy, grease-stained blue jeans stood perilously close to the yellow safety rope, his head cocked to the side like a bird listening for a worm in the earth. He looked entirely out of place in the sea of crisp camouflage uniforms, patriotic T-shirts, and expensive camera gear. He was a relic, a man whose skin was mapped with the deep, leathery crevices of 80 years of exposure to sun and wind, his knuckles swollen with arthritis, his posture slightly stooped as if he were perpetually carrying a heavy rucksack, and on his head sat a nondescript, sun-bleached baseball cap with a frayed brim that cast a shadow over eyes that were a startling, piercing blue. Eyes that were currently fixed not on the spectacle of the event, but on the smoking exhaust ports of a massive, olive-drab beast that was refusing to wake up. The vehicle in question was the star of the show, a meticulously restored M26 Pershing, the heavy that had been rushed into Europe in the dying days of World War II to hunt tigers, a 46-ton monster of cast steel and ballistic ambition that was currently sitting dead in the water in front of a VIP grandstand packed with generals, donors, and historians. The crew assigned to operate it, a hand-picked team of top-tier tankers from the 1st Armored Division, men accustomed to the digital precision and turbine whine of the modern M1A2 Abrams, were currently losing a war against analog mechanics. Staff Sergeant Kowalski, a broad-shouldered, square-jawed NCO with a reputation for perfection and a temper to match, was standing on the rear engine deck, his face streaked with oil and sweat, screaming instructions down the hatch to his driver, a young corporal named Mendez who was frantically mashing the starter pedal. The engine, a massive Ford GAF V8 that was notoriously underpowered for the tank's weight and temperamental in the heat, was cranking with a sluggish, agonizing whir-chug-chug-whir, coughing out thick plumes of black smoke that hung in the stagnant air but refusing to catch fire and roar to life. The crowd was getting restless, a low murmur of disappointment rippling through the bleachers as the announcer tried to fill the dead air with facts about the tank's 9mm gun, but Kowalski didn't hear the announcer. He only heard the sound of his career stalling out in front of the battalion commander. "Pump it! Pump the damn throttle!" Kowalski yelled, slamming his hand against the turret ring. "You're flooding it! No, wait, don't pump it! Hold it open!" "Jesus, Mendez, do you know how to start an engine or just play video games?" Keep listening. And which city are you listening from? And if you enjoy the story, please subscribe for more. Inside the sweltering steel box of the driver's compartment, Mendez was panicking, his inputs jerky and uncoordinated, treating the ancient carburetor like a modern fuel injection system, unaware that he was drowning the spark plugs in raw gasoline. The old man in the red shirt watched this unfold with a quiet, painful intensity, his lips moving silently as if he were reciting a prayer or a checklist. He took a shuffling step closer to the rope, his worn brown boots kicking up a small cloud of dust, and leaned forward, his instincts overriding the social contract of the spectator. "She's flooded, son," the old man said, his voice a raspy, gravel-filled rumble that was surprisingly loud for his frail frame. "You gotta let her sit. Clear the vapor lock. You keep cranking, you're gonna strip the starter gear." Kowalski, stressed to the breaking point and humiliated that his tank was the only one not running, snapped his head around and glared at the interruption. He saw what he interpreted as a confused, senile tourist, a grandfather who had wandered away from his tour group and was now offering unwanted advice. "Hey, back off the line!" Kowalski barked, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. "Sir, you need to step back behind the yellow rope. This is a hazardous area. We don't need input from the peanut gallery." The old man didn't move. He didn't even blink at the aggression. He just pointed a trembling, gnarled finger at the engine deck. "I'm telling you, Sergeant," he insisted, his tone calm but authoritative in a way that didn't match his appearance. "The Ford V8 hates the heat. You've got the magneto switch set to both. Switch it to left only for the start. It gives a hotter spark. And tell your boy to take his foot off the gas completely. She needs air, not juice." Kowalski stared at him, incredulous. The audacity of this civilian, this crumpled old man who looked like he struggled to start a lawnmower, telling an active-duty armor crewman how to operate a tank was infuriating. "Look, Grandpa," Kowalski sneered, climbing down from the deck to confront the man, looming over him with all the physical intimidation of a soldier in his prime. I appreciate that you probably drove a Buick in 1960, but this is a 40-ton war machine. It doesn't work like your station wagon. The manual says both. We follow the manual. Now, for the last time, move back before I have security escort you to the gift shop. A few people in the crowd near the ropes laughed, a nervous, tittering sound, enjoying the spectacle of the young sergeant dressing down the intrusive senior citizen. The old man's face didn't change. There was no embarrassment, no anger, just a deep, weary disappointment, the look of a man watching someone try to open a door by pushing on the pull side. The manual was written by engineers in Detroit who never had to start her in the mud at Cologne, the old man said softly, almost to himself. The manual is wrong. Kowalski rolled his eyes, turning his back on the man with a dismissive wave. Yeah, okay, sure. The manual is wrong. Thanks for the tip, Pat. Now get lost. He climbed back onto the tank, shouting down the hatch again. Mendez, ignore the crazy guy. Try it again. Crank it hard. The starter whined again, screech-chug-chug, a painful metallic sound of metal grinding against metal. The engine sputtered, fired once with a sound like a shotgun blast, and then died immediately, followed by an ominous hiss of escaping steam and the smell of burning electrical insulation. Smoke began to curl up from the engine grating, not exhaust smoke, but the acrid blue-gray smoke of an overheated starter motor. The crowd groaned. The VIPs in the stands were checking their watches. A colonel, the battalion commander, stood up in the VIP box, his face thunderous, and started walking toward the tank with the stride of an executioner. Kowalski froze. He knew that walk. He was about to get chewed out in front of 3,000 people. Damn it! Kowalski slammed his helmet against the armor. We burned the starter! Mendez, you idiot! The old man, still standing at the rope, shook his head slowly. I told you, he whispered. She needed air. The arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds was like a pressure drop in the atmosphere. The air grew heavy and static. Reynolds was a tall, imposing officer with a chest full of ribbons and a reputation for zero tolerance for incompetence. He stopped at the front slope of the Pershing, ignoring the heat radiating off the armor, and fixed Kowalski with a stare that could melt steel. Sergeant Kowalski, Reynolds said, his voice dangerously calm, explain to me why the centerpiece of this exhibition is sitting here smoking like a chimney while the Shermans and the Pattons are already in formation. Kowalski scrambled to attention, saluting sharply, his face pale beneath the grime. Sir, mechanical failure, sir. The engine is flooded and the starter motor appears to have seized. We followed the technical manual startup procedure, but the vehicle is non-responsive. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. The manual? You're telling me you can't start a heritage vehicle because of the manual? We have the Undersecretary of the Army in the stands, Sergeant. This is humiliated. Fix it, now. Sir, we can't, Kowalski admitted, his voice cracking slightly. If the starter is burned out, she's a brick. We'd need a recovery vehicle to tow her off. The humiliation was total. To be towed off the parade ground in front of the crowd would be the ultimate disgrace for a tanker. The old man, who had been listening intently, ducked under the yellow rope. A gasp went through the nearby crowd. A military police officer stepped forward, reaching for his belt, but the old man moved with a surprising, fluid purpose. She's not burned out, the old man said, interrupting the colonel. Reynolds turned, startled by the intrusion. He looked the old man up and down, the red shirt, the dirty jeans, the sheer lack of military bearing. Who are you? Reynolds demanded. Sergeant, why is there a civilian inside the perimeter? Kowalski lunged forward to grab the old man. I told you to leave. Get back. He grabbed the old man's arm, his grip rough. You're done, MP. Get him out of here. The old man didn't pull away. He looked at Kowalski's hand on his arm, then up at the sergeant's eyes. His gaze was steel hard, the confused tourist facade vanishing instantly to reveal something sharp and dangerous. Let go of me, son, the old man said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with a tone that made Kowalski hesitate instinctively. The starter solenoid is stuck because you overheated it. It needs a percussive reset, and the engine is vapor-locked. I can start it. Reynolds watched the exchange, his eyes darting between his struggling sergeant and this inexplicable intruder. He saw the way the old man stood, feet shoulder-width apart, balanced, unafraid. He saw the grease under the fingernails that wasn't fresh, but ingrained from a lifetime of work. You can start it, Reynolds asked, skeptical but desperate. This is government property. If you touch it and break it further, you'll be liable for damages. The old man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. It's already broken, Colonel. You want it running for the show, or do you want to call the tow truck? The colonel looked at the VIP stand. He looked at the smoking tank. He looked at Kowalski, who was paralyzed by indecision. Sergeant, Reynolds said, let him go. Kowalski dropped his hand as if burned. Sir, he's a civilian. He's a liability. He's our only option before I have to call a wrecker, Reynolds snapped. Step aside. The old man didn't wait for further permission. He walked to the rear of the tank, moving not like a tourist, but like a man walking into his own living room. He didn't climb the ladder. He grabbed the handholds on the hull and swung himself up with a muscle memory that defied his age, his boots finding the non-slip surfaces without looking. He knelt on the engine deck, the heat searing through his jeans, and opened the engine access hatch. A cloud of hot, oily smoke billowed out, enveloping him. Most men would have coughed. The old man inhaled it deeply, as if it were oxygen. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a heavy, adjustable wrench, something he had been carrying in his pants the whole time, explaining the sag. He reached down into the abyss of the engine bay, locating the starter solenoid by feel alone in the smoky darkness. Clang! He struck it once hard. Clang! Twice! "Mendez!" the old man shouted down the hatch, his voice booming over the engine deck. "Get your feet off the pedals, hands in your lap. Don't touch a damn thing until I tell you." Mendez, terrified and confused, obeyed instantly. "Yes, yes, sir." The old man reached into the compartment, finding the linkage for the carburetor. He manually manipulated the butterfly valve, holding it open to flush the air. He waited. He counted seconds in his head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. He was listening to the fuel drain back. He adjusted the magneto lever on the exterior housing, clicking it to left. He looked at Kowalski, who was watching with his mouth open. "You treat a machine like a slave, she rebels," the old man muttered. "You treat her like a partner, she fights for you." He stood up, wiping his hands on his red shirt. "All right, Mendez, battery switch on, fuel pump on, count to 3, then hit the starter, do not give it gas." "Copy," Mendez yelled. The whine of the fuel pump started, a healthy buzz this time. The old man closed his eyes, sensing the vibration. "Now," he whispered. Mendez hit the starter. Whir-chug roar. The difference was instantaneous. The starter engaged cleanly, the engine turned over twice, and then with a thunderous, ground-shaking bellow, the Ford V8 exploded into life. A massive plume of black smoke shot 10 feet into the air, followed by the steady, rhythmic idle of 500 horses waking up from a nightmare. The sound was visceral, a deep, chest-thumping bass note that drowned out the crowd, the announcer, and the skepticism. The tank was alive. The crowd erupted into cheers, thinking this was part of the show. Reynolds stood frozen, staring at the old man who was now casually closing the engine hatch as if he had just checked the oil in a sedan. Kowalski looked like he had been slapped. He had spent 20 minutes failing. The old man had spent 30 seconds succeeding. The old man climbed down from the hull, jumping the last 2 feet and landing with a heavy thud that made his knees buckle slightly, but he caught himself. He walked back to the rope, intending to disappear back into the anonymity of the crowd. But Reynolds stepped in front of him. The colonel's face had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by a burning curiosity and a dawning suspicion. "Hold on," Reynolds said, raising a hand. "You don't just walk away after that. You knew exactly where the solenoid strike point was. You knew the magneto trick. You didn't learn that in a museum." The old man adjusted his cap, pulling the brim lower. "I read a lot," he said evasively. "Mechanics is mechanics." "Bullshit," Reynolds said, the word cutting through the noise. "That's a Pershing. That's a nightmare of an engine. Only the guys who lived in them knew how to baby them like that." He stepped closer, looking at the faded red shirt, the lack of medals, the lack of any veteran insignia that most old soldiers wore with pride. "Who are you?" Kowalski stepped in, his pride still stinging, trying to regain some control. "Sir, he's probably just some old motor pool grease monkey who worked on tractors. We got lucky." The old man stiffened. The insult, grease monkey, hit a nerve. He looked at Kowalski, and for the first time a flash of fire appeared in his eyes. "I wasn't in the motor pool, son," the old man said quietly, "and I wasn't fixing tractors." "Then where did you learn to start an M26 in the middle of a heat wave?" Reynolds pressed. The old man sighed, looking at the tank, which was now idling smoothly, the beast finally tamed. "I learned to start it," the old man said, his voice dropping to a whisper that forced them to lean in, "because when the Chinese crossed the Yalu in 50 and the temperature dropped to 30 below, if you didn't keep that engine running, you froze to death, or they caught you." The reference hung in the air. The Yalu River, the Chosin Reservoir, the frozen hell of the Korean War. Reynolds' eyes widened. "You were in Korea with a Pershing unit?" The old man didn't answer directly. He just looked at the serial number painted on the side of the tank's turret. "That's not just a museum piece," he whispered, pointing at the steel beast. "That's Alice." Kowalski blinked. "Alice, the museum calls it the Eagle." "The museum is wrong," the old man said firmly. "Her name is Alice. I painted it on the barrel myself in Busan. And she has a dent on the underside of the transmission housing where we hit a mine in the corridor. Go check." Reynolds looked at Kowalski. "Check it." Kowalski hesitated. "Sir, Check the transmission housing, Reynolds barked. Kowalski scrambled under the front of the tank, crawling into the dirt. He stayed there for a long moment. When he slid back out, his face was drained of color, his eyes wide with shock. He looked up at the colonel, then at the old man. "Sir," Kowalski stammered, "there's a dent. Deep gouge, looks like blast damage. It's exactly where he said." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The confused tourist was gone. In his place stood a ghost, a man who claimed to have commanded the very piece of steel they were standing next to. But Reynolds wasn't done. He needed proof. "If this is your tank," Reynolds said, his voice respectful but probing, "then you know what's welded inside the commander's cupola. The crew always left a mark." The old man smiled, a sad, distant smile that broke hearts. "Under the vision block," he recited softly, "there's a St. Christopher medal welded to the steel, and 4 names scratched into the paint: Miller, Johnson, Kowalski, and Graves." Kowalski froze. "Kowalski," the sergeant whispered. "That's my name." The old man looked at the young sergeant, really looked at him this time. "Yeah," the old man said, "it's a common name, but the Kowalski I knew, he didn't make it out of the pass. He died loading the gun while I tried to keep the engine running." The young sergeant felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat. The crowd was watching, silent now, sensing the drama. The colonel stared at the old man. "You're telling me you are the commander of this tank from the Task Force Faith breakout?" "I was the driver," the old man corrected, "until the commander took a mortar fragment. Then I was the commander. Then I was the gunner. Then I was the only one left." He took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly, not from age but from the memory. "Now, Colonel, if you don't mind, I'd like to get back behind the rope. I just wanted to hear her run one last time." He turned to walk away, his figure small and unassuming against the backdrop of the massive machine. But Reynolds wasn't going to let him go. Not now, not ever. "Stop him!" Reynolds ordered, not to the MPs, but to Kowalski. "Sergeant, don't let him leave." Kowalski ran in front of the old man, but this time he didn't grab him. He blocked his path, his body language completely changed. He was no longer the bully, he was the student. "Sir," Kowalski said, his voice trembling, "please wait." The old man stopped, looking tired. "What now, son?" "The names," Kowalski whispered. "You said Kowalski was his first name. Stan." The old man's eyes widened slightly. "Stanley, yeah, big guy from Chicago, loved the Cubs." Kowalski's knees nearly gave out. Tears welled up in his eyes, cutting tracks through the grease on his face. "Stanley Kowalski was my grandfather," the young sergeant whispered. "He was MIA. We never knew what happened to him. We never knew. We never knew who was with him." The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. The old man stared at the young soldier, seeing the resemblance now, the jawline, the eyes. The connection spanned 70 years of silence, bridging the gap between a frozen mountain pass in 1950 and a hot parade ground in the present. "He didn't die alone, son," the old man said, his voice breaking for the first time. "I held him, and he told me to tell his Mary that he wasn't afraid." Kowalski choked back a sob. "Mary, that was my grandmother." The colonel stepped forward, removing his cover. He looked at the old man, then at the tank, then at the weeping sergeant. "Sir," Reynolds said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think you need to come up to the VIP stand. The general needs to meet you." The old man shook his head. "I'm not dressed for generals." "Sir," Reynolds said, "you're the best-dressed man here." But the tank was still idling, the engine purring, and suddenly the old man looked at the open hatch. He looked at the seat where he had spent the worst days of his life. "Can I?" he hesitated. "Can I sit in her one more time?" Reynolds didn't hesitate. "Clear the way," he shouted to the crowd. "Make a hole." The crowd parted. Kowalski wiped his eyes and stepped aside, gesturing to the tank. "After you, sir, please." The old man walked to the tank, but this time he didn't climb up like a mechanic. He climbed up like a warrior returning to his steed. And as he lowered himself into the commander's hatch, the crowd, sensing the magnitude of the moment, began to clap. It started slow, then built into a roar. But the old man didn't hear them. He only heard the engine and the voices of the ghosts inside. But this was only the beginning. Because as the old man sat in the hatch, looking through the periscope, his eyes locked onto something in the distance, something that shouldn't be there. A flash of light from the tree line beyond the parade ground, a reflection, a scope. The old man's instincts, honed in the frozen hell of Chasin, screamed a warning. This wasn't a parade anymore. Someone was watching the general. And the confused tourist was the only one who saw it. He grabbed the internal comms headset, shoving it onto his head. "Mendez," he roared, his voice changing from grandfather to killer in a nanosecond. "Traverse right, action front, threat in the tree line." Mendez, confused but terrified by the authority in the voice, obeyed. The massive turret of the Pershing began to swing, the barrel lowering, pointing directly at the VIP stand's perimeter. The crowd screamed. The MPs drew their weapons. They thought the old man had gone crazy. They didn't know he was the only thing standing between them and a disaster. The escalation had begun. The sudden, hydraulic whine of the turret traverse motor engaging was a sound that hadn't been heard on the parade ground in decades, a mechanical groan that cut through the cheering crowd like a scream. And as the massive, olive-drab muzzle of the 90 mm 3 cannon began to swing violently to the right, sweeping past the designated safety vectors and leveling out parallel to the ground, the festive atmosphere of the Legends of Steel exhibition evaporated in a single, terrifying heartbeat, replaced by the primal, chaotic frequency of panic. Inside the sweltering steel womb of the commander's cupola, the old man, Graves, was no longer the frail, shuffling figure who had been mocked for his trembling hands. He was a biological extension of the machine, his arthritis forgotten, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge by an adrenaline dump that felt exactly like the frozen terror of 1950. Except this time the enemy wasn't a wave of infantry crossing the Yalu, but a solitary, glinting predator hiding in the densely wooded ridgeline overlooking the VIP grandstand. "Traverse right! Steady! Steady! Drop 2 mils!" Graves barked into the internal comms, his voice cracking with the strain of shouting over the roar of the Ford V8 engine which was now thrumming beneath him, vibrating through the soles of his boots and up into his spine, waking up ghosts that had been sleeping in his marrow for 70 years. Below him, in the driver's hole, Corporal Mendez was hyperventilating, his hands white-knuckled on the steering laterals, his eyes darting around the cramped, smoke-filled compartment as the voice of a man he had just met, a civilian, a stranger, commanded him to effectively hijack a 46-ton war machine in front of the battalion commander. "Sir, we can't! The crowd! The colonel!" Mendez stammered, his foot hovering over the brake, paralyzed by the conflicting hierarchy of military discipline versus the terrifying, absolute authority of the old man's tone. "Forget the colonel!" Graves roared, leaning down into the hatch, his blue eyes blazing in the dim red light of the interior. "There is a laser designator painting the podium. Do you hear me, son? We are in a kill box. Move this tank hard right. Put us between the trees and the general." Outside, the scene was descending into madness. The crowd, realizing the gun was pointing vaguely in their direction before swinging past them toward the VIP stand, began to scream and scatter. Parents grabbing children, veterans diving for cover, the instinct for self-preservation turning the orderly bleachers into a stampede. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, standing just feet from the hull, watched in horror as the tank he was responsible for, the tank he had just allowed a civilian to enter, lurched forward, the tracks tearing up the manicured grass of the parade ground, throwing clods of earth high into the air. "Cease! Cease movement!" Reynolds screamed, his voice lost in the engine roar, his face turning a deep Venus purple as he realized his career was ending in real time. "Sergeant Kowalski, get him out of there! Neutralize the driver! Shut down that engine!" Kowalski, who had been standing on the hull near the engine deck, was thrown off balance by the sudden lurch, scrambling to grab a handhold on the turret ring to keep from being thrown under the churning tracks. He pulled himself up, adrenaline flooding his system, his mind torn between the revelation of who this old man was, a friend of his grandfather, and the immediate undeniable reality that the old man appeared to be having a catastrophic psychotic break, hallucinating a battle in the middle of a peacetime museum fundraiser. "Sir, Mr. Graves, stop!" Kowalski yelled, hammering on the side of the commander's hatch with his fist. "There's no enemy. It's a tree line. It's the parking lot. You're hallucinating. Stand down." But Graves didn't hear the plea, or if he did, he ignored it because his world had narrowed down to the periscope view, to the magnified image of the tree line where he had seen the unnatural reflection. Not sunlight on a leaf, but the distinct, rhythmic pulse of a targeting optic adjusting focus. He slammed the hatch shut and dogged the latch, sealing himself and the terrified Mendez inside the armor, cutting off the outside world, cutting off the colonel, cutting off the logic of peace. Inside, the noise was deafening, a cacophony of gears grinding, the engine screaming, and the suspension groaning as the M26 Pershing, a tank designed for the mud of Europe, surged forward onto the asphalt of the VIP access road, crushing a row of decorative planter boxes into dust. "He's locked the hatch!" Kowalski shouted to Reynolds, jumping off the back of the moving tank and rolling on the grass before scrambling to his feet. "He's barricaded inside. He's taken control of the vehicle." Reynolds ripped his radio from his belt, his hand shaking with rage. All units, we have a code black, rogue vehicle on the parade deck, civilian hostile in control of the M26, clear the grandstand, get the undersecretary out of there, SWAT team to my position, disable that tank." The escalation was instantaneous and brutal. The joyous celebration of military history had mutated into a hostage situation involving heavy armor. Military police cruisers, their blue lights flashing maniacally, peeled away from the perimeter and raced toward the slow-moving behemoth, drifting across the grass to form a blockade. But a Pershing tank does not respect the authority of a Ford Explorer. Graves saw the police cars rushing to cut him off, saw the officers spilling out with pistols and carbines drawn, leveling weapons at his tank, at Alice, and he felt a surge of bitter, tragic irony. They were trying to stop him from saving them. "Don't stop, Mendez," Graves commanded, his hand gripping the commander's override handle, ready to seize control if the kid froze. "They don't see it. They think I'm crazy. Keep moving. We need to block the line of sight. Go through the barricade." Mendez was crying now, tears streaming down his face, his headset askew. "They're pointing guns at us, sir. They're going to shoot." "Small arms fire," Graves scoffed, his voice filled with the contempt of a man who had taken mortar hits. "It won't scratch the paint. Drive, Corporal. Drive for your grandfather. Drive like hell." Mendez, broken by the pressure and fueled by the weird, ghostly connection the old man had invoked, slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The tank roared, black smoke billowing, and smashed through the wooden sawhorses and yellow rope, the tracks grinding the wood into splinters. The MPs scattered, diving out of the way as 46 tons of steel plowed through their blockade without slowing down. A frantic officer fired 3 shots at the vision blocks. Ping, 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 tiny futile sparks against the cast steel hull. Graves didn't flinch. He was busy scanning the ridge line again. The glint was gone. The shooter had moved, or he was waiting. "He's relocating," Graves muttered to himself, sweat stinging his eyes. "He saw the movement. He knows we're spoiling the shot. He's going to try for a deflection shot on the undersecretary as he moves to the car." Graves keyed the internal mic. "Mendez, hard left. We need to get onto the VIP extraction route. Cut across the lawn." The tank slewed sideways, tearing a massive gouge in the ornamental lawn, and rumbled toward the chaos of the VIP tent where Secret Service agents were currently shoving the undersecretary and the general into an armored SUV. To the Secret Service, the approaching tank looked like the assassination weapon. Agents raised their rifles, screaming into their earpieces. "Tank inbound! 6 o'clock! It's aggressive! Get the package out! Go! Go! Go!" Reynolds was running alongside the tank now, breathless, his face a mask of desperation. He grabbed the external infantry phone box on the rear fender, a relic that had been rewired for the show, and screamed into the handset. "Graves, listen to me. You are going to be shot. We have anti-materiel teams setting up. Stop the tank. The war is over. You are in Virginia. There are no Chinese troops. Stand down, soldier." Inside the cupola, Graves heard the voice crackle through the speaker, tinny and distant. The words, "the war is over," hit him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes for a second, the image of the frozen Chasin Pass flashing in his mind, the bodies stacked like cordwood to stop the wind, the sound of bugles in the night, the face of the real Stanley Kowalski turning blue in the snow. Was it over? Was he hallucinating? For a second, doubt clawed at his mind. Maybe he was just a senile old man. Maybe the glint was just a discarded bottle. Maybe he was terrorizing these people for nothing. But then he looked through the periscope again. The drone, it wasn't just a glint. It was a quadrotor delivery system, heavy lift, painted matte black to blend into the tree line, hovering just above the canopy, dropping altitude to align with the SUV. It wasn't a sniper rifle. It was a loitering munition, a suicide drone, and it was diving. "It's not a soldier," Graves whispered, his eyes widening. "It's a bird, a black bird." He grabbed the turret traverse again, spinning the manual hand crank because the hydraulic motor was too slow for his nerves. "Mendez, stop! Stop the tank right here!" The tank skidded to a halt, rocking violently on its suspension, positioning itself directly between the diving drone and the fleeing SUV. The drone, programmed to track the heat signature of the SUV, corrected its course, but the massive, hot thermal bloom of the tank's engine deck confused its sensors for a split second. The crowd, seeing the tank stop and the turret swing wildly, screamed louder, thinking the gun was about to fire into the VIP convoy. "He's aiming at the general," someone screamed. "Take the shot," Reynolds yelled to the SWAT sniper who had just set up on the museum roof. "Take out the optics, blind him." A high-velocity round slammed into the periscope head, shattering the glass inches from Graves' face. Shards of prism showered into the cupola, slicing his cheek. He recoiled, blood pouring down his face, mixing with the sweat and grease. "Damn it," he hissed, wiping the blood away with his sleeve. "Friendly fire, Mendez, stay down, button up." The glass was gone. He was blind on the right side. He had to open the hatch. He had to see the drone. If he didn't spot it, the general was dead. He threw the latch. "Sir, don't!" Mendez screamed. "They're shooting at us." "They're shooting at the tank," Graves growled, pushing the heavy steel hatch open. "I'm just the meat inside." He popped his head out of the cupola, exposing himself to the MPs, the SWAT team, and the colonel. The air was filled with shouting, sirens, and the roar of the tank's idle, but Graves ignored it all. He looked up. The drone was entering its terminal dive, a silent black streak against the blue sky, aiming for the gap between the tank and the SUV. It was going to miss the tank. It was going to hit the car. Graves realized he had positioned Alice wrong. He was 5 feet too far back. He couldn't move the tank in time. He had to distract it. He had to make the tank the juicier target. He scrambled out of the hatch, standing fully exposed on the turret roof, a wild, bloody figure in a red shirt, waving his arms, shouting at the sky. "Over here!" he screamed, his voice raw. "Come on, over here, you bastard!" He reached into the open hatch and grabbed the flare pistol, part of the historical reenactment kit that was stored in the turret. He didn't know if it was loaded. He didn't know if the flares were 70 years old. He snapped it open. A shell was there. He snapped it shut. He raised the flare gun not at the drone, but at the engine deck of the tank, at the vents where the heat poured out. He fired. The flare struck the engine grating and ignited, burning with a brilliant, blinding magnesium white heat, hotter than the SUV, hotter than the sun. The thermal spike was massive. The drone, confused by the sudden, intense heat source appearing directly in its path, shifted its guidance. It banked hard, turning away from the SUV, locking onto the burning flare on the back of the Pershing. Graves saw the nose of the drone dip. He saw the payload. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He didn't jump off. He didn't run. He dropped back into the hatch, slamming it shut and spinning the locking wheel just as the world turned white. The explosion was deafening. The drone impacted the rear engine deck of the tank, detonating its shaped charge. The blast wave lifted the 46-ton tank nearly a foot off the ground before slamming it back down, the suspension screaming in protest. A fireball engulfed the rear of the vehicle, shredding the engine compartment, blowing the armored louvers into the sky like confetti. Shrapnel pinged off the turret like hail. The concussion knocked Reynolds off his feet. The MPs were thrown backward. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the sudden violence. Smoke, thick and oily, poured from the back of Alice, obscuring everything. The tank sat motionless, burning. Inside, the lights were out. The engine was dead. The silence was absolute. Reynolds pushed himself up from the asphalt, his ears ringing, staring at the burning hulk of the museum piece. "Graves!" he whispered. He thought the old man had just blown himself up. He thought it was a suicide. The MPs rushed forward, weapons trained on the smoke. "Clear, move in, fire suppression!" The SWAT team advanced. The VIP SUV had stopped, the general looking back through the rear window, wide-eyed. They hadn't seen the drone. They only saw the tank explode. They thought the old man had tried to fire the main gun and suffered a catastrophic breech failure. The narrative was solidifying. The crazy veteran hijacked a tank and blew himself up trying to kill the undersecretary. "Hold fire!" Reynolds shouted, running toward the burning tank. "Get the fire extinguishers! Get him out!" He climbed onto the hull, the heat radiating through his boots, choking on the smoke. He reached the commander's hatch. It was jammed, warped by the heat or the blast. "Graves, can you hear me?" He hammered on the steel. Mendez, no answer, just the crackle of flames eating the paint, eating the history. Reynolds looked around, desperate. "I need a pry bar, get a breaker bar." Kowalski was there instantly, vaulting onto the tank with a heavy iron bar from the recovery vehicle that had just pulled up. His face was a mask of terror. "Is he in there? Is he alive?" "Get it open," Reynolds ordered. They jammed the bar into the gap, heaving with all their strength. The metal groaned. The latch popped. Reynolds threw the hatch open, expecting to see carnage. Smoke billowed out, blinding them. Reynolds coughed, waving it away, peering into the dark, acrid interior. "Graves!" A cough. A dry, hacking cough from the darkness. "I told you," a raspy voice whispered, weak but distinct. "The manual is wrong." Reynolds blinked, his eyes adjusting. Graves was slumped against the breech of the main gun, blood trickling from his ears, his red shirt covered in soot. Mendez was curled in a ball on the floor, shaking but alive. Graves looked up, his blue eyes peering through the gloom, shining with a fierce, defiant light. Did we get the bird?" Reynolds stared at him. "The bird." "The black bird," Graves wheezed. "The drone, I pulled the heat to the engine." Reynolds froze. He looked back at the engine deck. He saw the twisted wreckage, not just tank parts, carbon fiber, electronic boards, a shattered camera lens, the debris of a drone mixed with the steel of the tank. The realization hit Reynolds like a freight train. He hadn't tried to kill the general. He had intercepted a munition. He had used himself as bait. He had used the tank as armor. Reynolds looked back down at the old man, his anger evaporating, replaced by a cold, trembling awe. "You saved them," Reynolds whispered. "My God, you saved them all." Graves tried to sit up but grimaced, clutching his ribs. "Alice," he groaned. "How's Alice?" Reynolds looked at the burning engine compartment. The tank was a wreck. The historic Ford V8 was slag. The rear armor was compromised. "She took a hit, Gunny," Reynolds said softly. "She took a hell of a hit." Graves nodded slowly, closing his eyes. Good girl, he whispered. She always took a punch. He slumped back, losing consciousness. Get a medic, Reynolds screamed, his voice breaking. Get a medic up here now. Officer down, I repeat, officer down. He's a civilian, sir, an MP shouted from the ground. Reynolds spun around, standing tall on the turret of the burning tank, silhouetted against the smoke. He is a tank commander, Reynolds roared, the sound echoing across the silent parade ground. And he is under my command. Now get a medic or I will have your badge. The MPs scrambled. The paramedics rushed forward. Kowalski jumped into the hatch, lifting the old man's frail body with a tenderness that belied his size. They passed him up through the hatch, his limp form looking small against the massive machinery of war. As they lowered him to the ground, the crowd, confused but sensing the shift in the colonel's demeanor, began to murmur. They saw the blood. They saw the drone wreckage. They saw the general running back from the SUV, ignoring his security detail. General Mitchell, the three-star general who had been the target, pushed through the police line. He looked at the burning tank. He looked at the drone debris. He looked at the old man lying on the stretcher. Mitchell knelt down, grabbing Graves' hand, the hand that was still shaking, even in unconsciousness. "Who is this?" Mitchell demanded. "Who is this man?" Reynolds climbed down, his uniform ruined, his face soot-stained. He stood over the stretcher. "That," Reynolds said, his voice trembling with the weight of the truth, "is the man who started the engine when we couldn't, and stopped the war when we didn't know it had started." But the escalation wasn't over. As the paramedics loaded Graves into the ambulance, a black sedan screeched to a halt at the edge of the field. Men in suits, not Secret Service, but something else, something darker, stepped out. They moved with a predatory efficiency. They flashed badges that Reynolds didn't recognize. "We'll take it from here, Colonel," the lead agent said, stepping in front of the ambulance doors. "This is a national security incident. The suspect is in our custody." Reynolds stepped between the agent and the ambulance. "Suspect," Reynolds spat. "He's a hero. He's a man who hijacked a tank and detonated an explosive device near a protected person," the agent said coldly. "He's going to a black site for interrogation. Step aside." Reynolds put his hand on his sidearm. It was an unthinkable gesture for an officer to make toward a federal agent. The MPs behind him froze. Kowalski stepped up beside his colonel, his fists clenched. "He's not going anywhere," Reynolds said, his voice low. "He is a veteran of the United States Army, and he is wounded. He goes to the base hospital, or you go through me." The agent sneered. "You're making a mistake, Colonel. You don't know who you're dealing with." Reynolds leaned in, his face inches from the agent's. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Reynolds said. "I'm dealing with a suit, and he pointed to the ambulance. "He is the ghost of Chasen, and you don't touch a ghost." The standoff was electric. Federal agents versus the Army. Guns were half-drawn. The crowd was watching. The media helicopters were circling. And in the back of the ambulance, the old man's eyes fluttered open. He saw the suits. He saw the standoff. Reached up and pulled the oxygen mask off his face. "Colonel," Graves rasped. Reynolds turned. "Sir, don't fight them," Graves whispered. "Let them take me." Reynolds shook his head. "No, sir, I can't do that. Let them take me," Graves repeated, a faint, cunning smile touching his bloody lips. "I need to talk to them. I need to tell them where the bird came from." Reynolds paused. He saw the look in the old man's eyes. It wasn't surrender. It was a trap. The old man wasn't done fighting. He was just moving the battlefield. Reynolds stepped back, holstering his weapon. "Fine," Reynolds said to the agent. "He's yours, but I'm following the ambulance with a tank platoon." The agent blinked. "That won't be necessary." "I wasn't asking," Reynolds said. He turned to Kowalski. "Sergeant, mount up. Get the Abrams. We have an escort mission." As the ambulance doors closed, swallowing the old man back into the darkness, the real questions began to surface. Who launched the drone? Why? And how did a retired janitor know it was coming? The engine of the ambulance started. But behind it, the turbine whine of a modern M1A2 Abrams began to spool up. The old man had started the Pershing. Now he had started the whole division. The escalation was complete. The war had come home. The convoy that departed the smoking ruins of the National Armor Museum was unlike any procession that had ever traversed the quiet, tree-lined streets of the Virginia suburbs. A surreal and terrifying juxtaposition of domestic normalcy and overwhelming military force that caused traffic to freeze and pedestrians to stand gaping on the sidewalks with their phones raised in trembling hands. Leading the column was the ambulance carrying Thomas Graves, its sirens wailing with a frantic, piercing urgency that bounced off the brick facades of the colonial-style homes. But it was not the emergency vehicle that commanded the attention of the stunned civilians. It was the escort that followed immediately behind it, a phalanx of 3 M1A2, except 3 Abrams main battle tanks from the 1st Armored Division's demonstration team. Their massive 120 smoothbore cannons locked in travel position, but their turret machine guns manned by grim-faced soldiers who looked ready to engage a threat at a moment's notice. The ground shook with a rhythmic, tectonic vibration as the 68-ton beasts tore up the asphalt, their Honeywell gas turbine engines emitting a high-pitched, banshee-like whine that drowned out the sirens and the birds and the ambient noise of the afternoon. A sonic declaration that the United States Army had effectively declared martial law on a 3-mile stretch of road to protect one old man in a faded red shirt. Inside the claustrophobic, sterile confines of the ambulance, the atmosphere was pressurized with a different kind of volatility. A thick, suffocating tension that smelled of rubbing alcohol, copper blood, and the ozone of unspent violence. Graves lay on the gurney, his chest rising and falling in shallow, hitched breaths, an oxygen mask strapped over his soot-stained face, his eyes half closed but tracking every movement of the man sitting on the bench opposite him. The man, Special Agent Thorne of the Department of Homeland Security's Internal Threat Division, was the archetype of the suit. Immaculate charcoal tailoring, a tie that cost more than Graves' truck, and a face that was devoid of any human warmth, masked by a pair of aviator sunglasses that he refused to remove even in the dim light of the vehicle. Thorne held a tablet in his lap, his thumbs flying across the screen as he coordinated with a command center that was already spinning a narrative of domestic terrorism. A narrative that painted the old tanker not as a hero, but as a deranged radical who had endangered a high-value target. "You realize, Mr. Graves," Thorne said, his voice smooth and detached, barely audible over the roar of the tanks outside, that you have committed roughly 12 felonies in the last hour. Grand theft of government property, destruction of federal assets, reckless endangerment, assault on a federal officer, and utilizing a weapon of war in a civilian zone. That's just the start. By the time we get to the secure facility, the lawyers will have added treason to the list." Graves slowly reached up and pulled the oxygen mask down, ignoring the medic's protest, and coughed a wet, hacking sound that brought up specks of black carbon from his lungs. He looked at Thorne with a pity that seemed to infuriate the agent more than anger would have. "You're worried about the law," Graves rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper on stone. "You should be worried about the geometry." Thorne paused, his fingers hovering over the tablet. "Geometry is that code. Who are you working with, Graves? Who gave you the transponder frequency for the drone?" Graves chuckled, a painful wheeze that rattled his ribs. "I didn't need a frequency. I needed a line of sight. And you're asking the wrong questions. You're asking how I stopped it. You should be asking why it was there." Thorne leaned in, his cologne cloying and expensive in the small space. "We know why it was there. You or your accomplices launched it to create a spectacle, a hero complex. You start the fire so you can put it out. Classic narcissism." Graves closed his eyes, shaking his head slightly against the pillow. "You're a fool in a fancy suit," he whispered. "That bird was a Chinese-manufactured Lungroman 2 loitering munition, but it was modified with a graph-based targeting algorithm that hasn't been seen since the Aleppo testbed in 2018. It wasn't targeting the general. It was targeting the briefcase the undersecretary was carrying, the nuclear modernization protocols." Thorne stiffened, the color draining slightly from his perfectly shaved jaw. He hadn't mentioned the briefcase. No one had. It was classified top secret. "How do you know about the briefcase?" Thorne hissed, his hand dropping to the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. "Who turned you?" Graves opened his eyes again, and the steel blue intensity pinned Thorne to the wall of the ambulance. "Nobody turned me, son. I just listen. And right now, I hear 3 turbine engines protecting me because Colonel Reynolds knows what you don't. He knows that if I wanted the undersecretary dead, I wouldn't need a drone. I'd just need a phone book and a strong wind." The ambulance lurched as it turned sharply into the gates of the base hospital, the suspension groaning, and the conversation was cut short by the chaotic arrival at the emergency bay. The scene at the hospital entrance was a standoff of cinematic proportions, a collision of jurisdictions that threatened to spiral into blue-on-green violence. The ambulance screeched to a halt under the awning, and Thorne kicked the doors open, stepping out with his badge raised high, shouting for the awaiting medical team to take custody of the prisoner under federal containment protocols. "Clear the bay," Thorne shouted to the hospital staff. "This wing is locked down. No unauthorized personnel. DHS jurisdiction." But his voice was swallowed by the terrifying, thunderous arrival of the Abrams tanks. The lead tank, commanded by Colonel Reynolds himself, roared into the parking lot, crushing a concrete curb into dust, and swung its massive turret around to cover the entrance, the coaxial machine gun pointing skyward but the sheer presence of the armor screaming defiance. Reynolds leaped from the turret before the tank had fully stopped, his dress uniform ruined, his face smeared with soot, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He marched toward the ambulance with the stride of a man who had run out of patience for bureaucracy. A phalanx of MPs, confused and caught in the middle, looked from the federal agents to the angry colonel, unsure who to obey. "Stand down, agent!" Reynolds barked, interposing himself between Thorne and the gurney as the paramedics unloaded Graves. "This man is a casualty of war. He goes to the trauma unit, and my men will secure the perimeter. Your jurisdiction ends at the door until he is stable." Thorne stepped into Reynolds' face, the two men nose to nose, a clash of authority that crackled with electricity. "You are obstructing a federal investigation, Colonel," Thorne spat. "I can have you stripped of your rank and in a cell by tonight." Reynolds didn't blink. "You can try," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "But right now, I have 3 main battle tanks and a battalion of angry armor crewmen who just watched this man save their general. So unless you want to see what a sabot round does to a sedan, you will step aside and let the doctors work." Thorne hesitated, looking at the grim faces of the tank crews who had popped their hatches and were watching the exchange with cold, predatory eyes. He realized he had lost the physical battle. He stepped back, straightening his tie with a sharp, angry motion. "Fine," Thorne said. "He gets treated, but I'm in the room. And the moment he's stitched up, the interrogation begins. And Colonel, if he dies, it's on you." Reynolds ignored him, turning to the paramedics. "Move, get him inside, trauma one." The gurney was rushed through the sliding glass doors, the wheels clattering on the linoleum, Graves looking up at the fluorescent lights blurring past, his mind drifting back to other ceilings, other hospitals, other times he had been broken and put back together. He felt the vibration of the tanks fading, replaced by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the sharp commands of the trauma team. They cut his red shirt open, the faded fabric that had been his armor, revealing a torso that was a roadmap of violence. Jagged white scars from shrapnel, the puckered crater of a bullet wound near his clavicle, the burn marks from a long-ago fire. The young ER doctor, a resident who looked barely out of medical school, stared at the scarred landscape of the old man's chest for a second, stunned. "My God," the doctor whispered. "What happened to this man?" Graves, drifting in and out of consciousness, grabbed the doctor's wrist with a grip that made the young man flinch. "Life," Graves rasped. "Life happened, just don't use the good scissors on the jeans. There, vintage." The trauma bay was quickly converted into a makeshift interrogation cell. Once Graves' ribs were taped and the lacerations on his face sutured, a process he endured without anesthesia, merely gripping the side of the bed until his knuckles turned white. Thorne cleared the room of medical staff, leaving only the monitors, the colonel, and the old man. The air conditioning hummed, cold and sterile, raising gooseflesh on Graves' exposed arms, but he didn't shiver. He sat propped up against the pillows, looking small and frail, but his eyes were alert, scanning the room, assessing the exits, the ventilation ducts, the weapons on Thorne's belt. It was a habit he couldn't break. Thorne paced the small room, tapping his tablet, trying to build momentum. "Let's start with the name," Thorne said aggressively. "Thomas J. Graves, retired 1978, service record redacted, pension file locked. You're a ghost, Graves. You don't exist in the VA system. You don't exist in the IRS database." "Why?" Graves took a sip of water from a plastic cup, his hand shaking so badly the water rippled. "I like privacy," he said simply. "Privacy?" Thorne scoffed. "You have the skill set of a Tier 1 operator, the mechanical knowledge of a master engineer, and you're working as a janitor at a museum. That's not privacy, that's a cover. Who are you hiding from?" Reynolds, standing guard by the door with his arms crossed, spoke up. "He's not hiding, Agent. He's resting. He's done his time." Thorne whipped around. "Stay out of this, Colonel. This man just identified a classified enemy drone by sight. That's not resting. That's active intelligence." He turned back to Graves, leaning over the bed. "The drone, Graves, the Lung Roman 2, you said it was targeting the nuclear protocols. How do you know that? Are you part of the cell? Did you get cold feet at the last second?" Graves sighed, a deep, rattling sound. "I know it," he said softly, "because I wrote the vulnerability assessment for the suitcases shielding in 1982. And I know the drone because I didn't just see it, I heard it." Thorne blinked. "You heard it. The Lung Roman 2 has a distinct harmonic variance in its rotor pitch," Graves explained, his voice gaining strength as he slipped into technical analysis. "It uses a mismatched prop setup to reduce acoustic signature, but it creates a beat frequency at 40 Hz, like a hummingbird with a broken wing. I heard that sound in the Sudan in 98, and I heard it in the Crimea in 14. It's a signature. It means the guidance package isn't standard. It's a hunter-killer mod." The room fell silent. Thorne stared at the old man, the janitor, who was casually discussing acoustic signatures of classified drone warfare. The disparity between the man's appearance and his knowledge was becoming impossible to reconcile. "Sudan!" Thorne whispered. You were retired in '78. Graves smiled, a thin, cryptic curling of his lip. Retirement is a paperwork status, Agent. It doesn't mean you stop working. It just means you stop getting credit. Suddenly, the door to the trauma room burst open. Sergeant Kowalski stood there, breathless, holding a clear plastic evidence bag. Behind him, 2 MPs blocked the hallway, preventing Thorne's backup from entering. Colonel, Kowalski shouted, ignoring Thorne's outrage. You need to see this. We sifted the wreckage, the engine deck of the Pershing. He walked over and dumped the contents of the bag onto the metal tray table next to Graves' bed. It was a blackened, twisted piece of circuit board, fused with a jagged shard of olive-drab steel from the tank. But amidst the melted plastic, one component was intact, a microchip with a serial number etched into the ceramic. Thorne grabbed it, his eyes widening. That's a mil-spec receiver, Thorne stammered. U.S. origin. This drone wasn't Chinese, it was stolen tech. Graves reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the shard, running his thumb over the serial number. It wasn't stolen, Graves said, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled the room. It was sold. He looked up at Reynolds. Colonel, look at the prefix. MK Ultra 9, that's not a standard export code, that's a prototype designation. Reynolds leaned in, his face pale. Prototype from where? From the DARPA Black Wing project, Graves said. Cancelled in 2015, or so they said. He looked at Thorne, his eyes hard. You're looking for a terrorist cell, Agent. You should be looking at your own supply chain. This hit didn't come from a cave in the mountains. It came from a boardroom. Thorne stepped back, the implications terrifying him. If Graves was right, this was an inside job, a false flag, an assassination attempt disguised as a foreign attack. You're lying, Thorne said weakly. You're trying to deflect. Am I? Graves asked. Call the number on that chip, see who answers, but I bet you won't like the voice on the other end. The shift was happening. The power dynamic in the room had completely inverted. Thorne was no longer the interrogator. He was the one in the dark. Graves, the prisoner, was the analyst. Reynolds, the protector, was the enforcer. And outside, the world was waking up to the legend. But the tension was about to snap. The hospital's PA system chimed, a soft, innocuous tone that preceded a nightmare. Code Silver, Trauma Wing, Lockdown. Code Silver meant an active shooter or a hostile breach. Reynolds drew his weapon instantly. Thorne, is this your team? No, Thorne shouted, drawing his own gun. My team is holding the perimeter. The sound of suppressed gunfire erupted from the hallway, thwip, 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 followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. Graves sat up, ripping the IV line from his arm, blood welling at the puncture site. They're here to clean up the mess, Graves said, swinging his legs off the bed, his boots hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Who? Reynolds yelled, moving to barricade the door. The people who sold the chip, Graves said, grabbing a pair of surgical scissors from the tray. They know I survived, they know I saw the drone, and they know I know the signature. The door handle jiggled, locked. Then a shaped charge detonated on the hinges, a deafening crack that blew the door inward in a shower of sparks and metal. Smoke filled the room. Reynolds opened fire through the smoke, his rounds impacting the ballistic shields of the tactical team storming the room. These weren't standard hitmen, they moved with the fluid precision of Tier 1 operators. Black gear, no patches, night vision goggles even in the light. Kowalski tackled Thorne to the ground as rounds chewed up the wall behind them. Get the old man down, Kowalski screamed, but Graves wasn't going down. He was moving. In the chaos of the smoke and the gunfire, the old man moved not like a geriatric patient, but like a phantom. He didn't run away from the breach. He moved into the blind spot of the doorframe. As the lead operator stepped through, scanning for the colonel, Graves struck. It was a move from a forgotten manual, a drop step to the inside, the surgical scissors driving not into the armor, but into the unprotected gap of the operator's armpit, severing the brachial artery. The operator grunted and collapsed, his MP5 submachine gun clattering to the floor. Graves, his hands shaking violently but his timing perfect, snatched the weapon before it stopped sliding. He rolled onto his back, firing a 3-round burst from the hip that caught the second operator in the knee, dropping him. Reynolds, the window, Graves roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in their ears. We have to move, they'll frag the room. Reynolds, stunned by the old man's violence, grabbed Kowalski and dragged him toward the reinforced glass of the trauma bay window. Thorne was scrambling backward, terrified. Who are these people? Thorne screamed. The cleaners, Graves shouted, firing another burst to suppress the hallway. And right now, I'm the only reason you're breathing. Move! Reynolds smashed the window with the butt of his pistol, the safety glass shattering into 1,000 diamonds. The cool evening air rushed in. Outside, the tank crews were shouting, turning the turrets toward the building, confused by the internal gunfire. Hold fire! Reynolds screamed into his radio. Friendly's coming out! Friendly's coming out! They spilled out of the window onto the loading dock. Reynolds, Kowalski, a terrified Thorne, and finally Graves, limping, bleeding, holding a submachine gun with a grip that trembled but didn't waver. They were pinned against the brick wall, the hospital behind them now a kill zone. The tactical team inside was regrouping. "We need cover," Kowalski yelled. Graves looked at the nearest Abrams tank, bunker buster, parked 30 yards away, its engine idling with a low growl. He looked at Reynolds. "Colonel," Graves said, a wild, desperate grin breaking through the soot on his face. "Do you trust me?" Reynolds looked at the old man, then at the death squad coming through the window. "I trust you, Gunny." "Then give me the tank," Graves said. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He keyed his radio. "Bunker 1, abandoned vehicle. Leave the engine running. Pop the hatch, now!" The crew of the lead tank bilayed out, confused but obeying the frantic order. Graves threw the MP5 to Kowalski. "Cover me!" He ran. He ran with a limp, his bad knee buckling, his breath tearing at his lungs, crossing the open asphalt toward the massive steel beast. Bullets skipped off the pavement around his feet. He didn't stop. He reached the hull. He climbed. It was harder this time. His body was failing him. But he hauled himself up, cresting the turret, and dropped into the commander's hatch of the M1A2 Abrams. It was different from the Pershing, digital screens, thermal optics, a yoke instead of levers, but the soul was the same. It was armor. It was home. He dropped into the seat, his hands flying across the controls, overriding the safety interlocks. He didn't need a manual. He spoke the language of steel. The turbine engine screamed as he pushed the throttle to the stops. The turret swung around, the 120 cannon leveling at the hospital window where the hit squad was emerging. He didn't fire the main gun. That would kill everyone. He triggered the smoke launchers. Thump, thump, thump. Canisters of white phosphorus smoke exploded in front of the hospital, creating an instant wall of cover. "Get in!" Graves' voice boomed over the external speaker. "Get on the deck! We are leaving!" Reynolds, Kowalski, and Thorne scrambled onto the back of the moving tank as Graves slammed the transmission into gear. The Abrams lurched forward, crushing a police cruiser flat as it accelerated out of the hospital lot, not retreating but hunting. The rehook was set. The old man wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a tank commander again, and he had just declared war on the shadow government. "Hang on!" Graves yelled from inside the turret. "I know where the signal came from. We're going to the source." The shift was complete. The confused tourist was now leading a rogue tank assault on a domestic target to stop a nuclear incident. And the scariest part, he was the only one who knew the way. The 68-ton M1A2 SEP-3 Abrams main battle tank, christened Bunker Buster by its original crew, but now commandeered by a bleeding 80-year-old veteran and a renegade colonel, roared down the center lane of Interstate 95 like a prehistoric beast unleashed into a digital world. Its Honeywell AGT 1500 gas turbine engine screaming with a high-pitched, jet-like whine that shattered the suburban quiet and sent rush-hour commuters swerving onto the shoulders in a panic of screeching tires and blaring horns. Inside the turret, the environment was a sensory overload of glowing multifunction displays, thermal imagery feeds, and the claustrophobic smell of recycled air and hydraulic fluid. A stark contrast to the freezing, open-air cockpit of the Pershing tank Graves had driven in 1950. Yet as his trembling hands gripped the black yoke of the commander's station, Thomas Graves felt a terrifying sense of familiarity settle into his bones, a realization that the soul of armor had not changed in 70 years. It was still just a steel box carrying fragile men through a world that wanted them dead. He wasn't driving the tank. He was commanding it, his mind integrating with the digital architecture of the fire control system as if he had been born to it, overriding the safety governors to push the turbine to its thermal limit because he knew, with the certainty of a man who can smell rain before it falls, that they had less than 10 minutes before the airspace above them became a kill zone. Colonel Reynolds, crammed into the loader's station and frantically monitoring the tactical radio network, was shouting over the turbine whine, his voice laced with the desperate urgency of an officer who has gone fully rogue. "Graves, we have 2 R-64 Apache lifting off from Quantico. They are armed hot. They are tagging us as a hostile domestic threat. You need to tell me where we are going, Gunny. We are running out of road." Graves didn't look at Reynolds. He stared at the GPS moving map display, his eyes narrowing as he cross-referenced the digital grid with a memory of a map he had seen on the microchip shard. "Sector 4, Graves rasped into the boom mic, his voice steady despite the pain radiating from his broken ribs. "The industrial park off exit 160, the building with no signage. That's where the uplink is. That's where they flew the bird from." Special Agent Thorne, currently huddled on the floor of the turret basket in a fetal position, clutching his tablet like a shield, screamed up at them. "That's a defense contractor. That's Sentinel Dynamics. You can't just drive a tank into a federal contractor's facility. That's treason. They'll drop a hellfire on us before we get within a mile." Graves glanced down at the agent, his lip curling in disgust. "They won't drop a hellfire, Agent," Graves growled, "because they don't want to destroy the evidence inside that building. They want to bury it, and us along with it." The tank lurched violently as Graves executed a combat pivot turn onto the off-ramp, the composite tracks tearing up the asphalt, throwing sparks and debris into the air as the massive machine drifted sideways before biting into the pavement and surging forward toward the towering glass and steel structure of Sentinel Dynamics. But the cleaners were not waiting passively. They had deployed a blocking force. As the Abrams rounded the corner toward the facility's main gate, the road ahead was blocked by 3 black armored SUVs, the same type that had delivered the hit squad to the hospital, arranged in a V formation with men in tactical gear deploying behind them, shouldering tubes that Graves recognized instantly. "RPG!" Graves roared. "Active protection, hot!" Before the words had even left his mouth, a smoke trail erupted from the SUV line, a rocket-propelled grenade streaking toward the front slope of the tank. In 1950, this would have been the end. The warhead would have melted through the steel and incinerated the crew. But Bunker Buster was not a relic. The Trophy Active Protection System, a radar-guided shotgun mounted on the turret, detected the incoming projectile, calculated its trajectory in milliseconds, and fired a countermeasure. Boom! A small, controlled explosion detonated the RPG in midair, 30 feet from the tank, sending a shower of harmless shrapnel raining down on the road. The shockwave rattled the hull, but the tank didn't slow down. "Flash out!" Reynolds yelled, awestruck by the technology he oversaw but had rarely seen used in anger on American soil. Graves didn't pause to celebrate. "Kowalski!" he barked to the young sergeant who had squeezed into the gunner's seat. "Coax! Suppress the vehicles! Don't kill them, just break their toys!" Kowalski, his hands shaking with adrenaline, gripped the control handles. "On the way!" The coaxial M240 machine gun roared to life, a chainsaw buzz of 7.62 rounds that chewed through the engine blocks of the blockade SUVs, shattering windshields and sending the tactical team scrambling for cover. Graves didn't stop. He didn't swerve. He drove the 68-ton Abrams directly through the wreckage, the sound of crushing metal and shattering glass sickeningly loud as the tank flattened the SUVs like aluminum cans, clearing the path to the main gate. "Apache inbound!" Reynolds screamed, listening to the terrified chatter on the military frequency. "Pilot is requesting weapons free. He has a lock. Graves, they are going to fire. We need to authenticate. We need a code." The situation had reached its terminal velocity. The U.S. Army was seconds away from destroying its own asset to stop what looked like a terrorist attack. Graves kept his eyes on the building, which was now looming large in the vision blocks, a fortress of secrets disguised as an office. "Get General Mitchell on the line," Graves ordered. "Direct frequency. Bypass the TOC." "I can't," Reynolds yelled. "They've jammed the command net. We are isolated." Graves slammed his fist against the console. "Then use the guard frequency. Use the distress channel. Every pilot monitors 243. Do it." Reynolds switched the radio, his fingers fumbling. "Broadcasting in the blind. This is Colonel Reynolds aboard Bunker 1. Cease fire. Cease fire. We have high-value intelligence. Do not engage." Static hissed back. Then a cold, robotic voice from the Apache pilot. "Bunker 1, you are designated hostile. Maintain current position and power down or you will be engaged. You have 10 seconds. The targeting laser warning receiver in the turret began to scream, a piercing, high-pitched alarm that signaled a Hellfire missile had locked onto their heat signature. 10 seconds to death. Thorne began to sob. Kowalski looked at the screen, paralyzed. Graves did not freeze. He reached over and grabbed the handset from Reynolds, his grip iron-hard despite the tremors. He keyed the mic, broadcasting to the pilots, to the general, to the world. "Apache lead," Graves spoke, his voice dropping into a register that was ancient, calm, and terrifyingly authoritative. "This is Wraith, authentication code, Winter 09 Chasen. I'm moving to secure the package. If you fire on this tank, you are burning the American flag. Check your fire, son. Check your damn fire." There was a moment of silence that stretched for an eternity, a silence where the fate of 4 men hung in the balance of a pilot's decision. The code, Winter 0, was not a standard encryption. It was a legacy override, a ghost key from the Cold War meant to identify deep cover assets operating behind enemy lines. It shouldn't have worked. It shouldn't have even been in the database. But high above the industrial park, inside the cockpit of the lead Apache, the pilot's display flashed a warning he had never seen before. Authority override, level 1 asset. The pilot froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. Command, the pilot stammered over the net. Target has broadcast a legacy code. System is flagging it as valid. Request instructions. Back at the base command center, General Mitchell was staring at the audio waveform on his screen, his face draining of color. He recognized the voice. He recognized the code. It was the code he had been briefed on as a lieutenant, the code for the lost unit. Mitchell grabbed his headset. Apache lead, this is Mitchell. Check fire. Repeat, check fire. That tank is friendly. Do not engage. Escort only. Get me a perimeter around that building now. The missile lock warning silenced. The Apache broke their attack run, banking hard and taking up a hovering position over the tank, their guns turning outward to face the facility. Graves exhaled, a shuddering breath that rattled his lungs. Good boy, he whispered. Now, let's knock. He pushed the throttle forward. The Abrams accelerated toward the main lobby of Sentinel Dynamics, a glass atrium that screamed corporate arrogance. The cleaners inside the building opened fire with small arms, bullets sparking uselessly off the depleted uranium armor. Graves ignored them. He wasn't there to shoot. He was there to breach. Brace! He shouted. The tank hit the glass facade at 30 miles per hour. The collision was a chaotic symphony of destruction. Steel beams buckled, reinforced glass shattered into millions of diamonds, and the massive tank plowed into the lobby, sliding across the polished marble floor and crashing through the security turnstiles before coming to a halt in front of the elevators, dust and debris raining down on the turret. The engine idled with a menacing growl, filling the lobby with exhaust fumes. Dismount, Graves ordered. Kowalski, stay on the gun. Watch the stairs. Reynolds, you're with me. Thorne, try not to get shot. Graves popped the commander's hatch and climbed out, holding the MP5 he had taken from the hospital assassin. He slid down the front slope of the tank, his boots crunching on the glass, and looked like a demon rising from hell, soot-stained, bleeding, furious. Reynolds dropped down beside him, weapon raised. They moved toward the server room indicated on the floor plan Graves had memorized from the chip's metadata. The building was in chaos. Alarms were blaring, sprinklers were raining water down on them, and employees were fleeing. But the security team, the cleaners, were holding the hallway to the data center. A heavy steel door blocked the path. Breach charge, Reynolds yelled. I don't have one. Graves didn't wait. He turned to the tank. Kowalski, the door. Coax, cut it. Inside the tank, Kowalski swung the turret, the long barrel knocking over a potted plant as he aligned the coaxial machine gun with the server room door. He squeezed the trigger. A stream of tracers hammered the hinges, shredding the metal. The door fell inward with a heavy clang. Graves stepped through the smoke, entering the nerve center of the operation. Rows of server racks hummed with blue lights. And there, standing by the main terminal, was the man responsible. A man in a suit, frantically typing on a keyboard, trying to initiate a remote wipe. It was Director Vance of the Defense Logistics Agency, a man Graves recognized from the news, a man who had authorized the drone strike to silence the investigation into the missing nuclear funds. Vance looked up, terror in his eyes, as the old man in the red shirt limped into the room, leveling the MP5 at his chest. Step away from the console, Graves rasped, water from the sprinklers dripping off his nose. It's over. Vance froze, his hand hovering over the enter key. You're too late, old man, Vance sneered, though his voice trembled. The wipe is initiated. In 10 seconds, all the evidence of the prototype sales, the drone logs, the fund diversion, it's all gone. You have nothing. Graves didn't shoot. He didn't yell. He just lowered the gun and smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. I don't need the data on the drive, Vance, Graves whispered. I have the tank. He keyed his radio. Kowalski, the server rack, main unit, high explosive, put a round in it. Vance's eyes bulged. You're crazy, you'll destroy the building. No, Graves said, I'm just formatting the drive. He turned and walked out of the room. Kowalski, send it. Boom, the 120 cannon fired inside the lobby. The concussion was devastating. The server room evaporated in a fireball, the blast wave blowing out the remaining windows of the ground floor. Vance was thrown across the room, alive but stunned, the terminal destroyed. But more importantly, the physical hard drives were not wiped. They were scattered, damaged, but the forensic magnetic data would still be recoverable from the fragments. A software wipe cleans data. A high-explosive round just moves it around. As the dust settled, sirens wailed from every direction. SWAT teams, FBI, HRT, and military police swarmed the building. General Mitchell's command vehicle screeched to a halt outside the shattered lobby. Mitchell ran in, surrounded by soldiers, stepping over the glass and debris. He saw the tank parked in the lobby. He saw Reynolds and Kowalski covering the prisoner, Vance, and he saw Graves. The old man was sitting on the edge of the fountain in the center of the lobby. The water turned red from the blood dripping from his side. He had dropped the MP5. Was holding his side, breathing heavily, his head bowed. General Mitchell stopped 10 feet away. He signaled his men to lower their weapons. He walked slowly toward the old man. Mitchell was a three-star general, a man who commanded legions, but as he looked at the battered figure in the red shirt, he felt like a cadet. "Graves?" Mitchell asked softly. The old man looked up. His face was gray, his eyes dimming slightly from blood loss, but the fire was still there. "Jimmy," Graves whispered. "You got gray." Mitchell swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "And you got loud," Graves chuckled, a wet, painful sound. "Had to, the manual was wrong." Mitchell stood up straight. He looked around at the hundreds of soldiers, agents, and police officers who had encircled the lobby, weapons trained on the scene, unsure of what they were seeing. "Attention!" Mitchell bellowed, his voice echoing off the shattered glass ceiling. "Secure the prisoner Vance and get a medic for this officer." A young SWAT captain stepped forward. "Officer!" "Sir, that's the suspect. That's the civilian who hijacked the tank." Mitchell turned on him with a fury that terrified the room. "Civilian!" Mitchell pointed at Graves. "You are looking at Master Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Graves, the Wraith of the Highlands, the man who held the Pusan perimeter alone for 6 hours, the man who wrote the book on armored reconnaissance. He is not a suspect, Captain. He is the reason you speak English, and he is under my personal protection." The room went silent. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. The janitor was gone. The legend had taken his place. Slowly, deliberately, General Mitchell snapped his heels together. He raised his hand in a slow, sharp salute. Reynolds followed, then Kowalski, then the tank crews who had rushed in, then the MPs. One by one, the arms went up, a wave of respect rippling through the lobby, honoring the old man sitting on the fountain. Graves looked at them. He looked at the salutes. He tried to stand, but his legs failed him. He sat back down, his shaking hands resting on his knees. He didn't return the salute this time. He just nodded, a slow, tired nod of acceptance. He had come out of the shadows. He had saved the day, and now all he wanted was to sleep. "At ease," Graves whispered, his voice fading. "At ease." As the medics rushed in, swarming him, placing him on a stretcher, Agent Thorne stood in the background, watching. He looked at his tablet, at the red arrest warrant for Graves. He slowly pressed the delete button. He walked over to Reynolds. "Colonel," Thorne said quietly, "I'll handle the paperwork. It was a training exercise. The drone was a foreign attack. Graves was a consultant." Reynolds looked at the suit. "A consultant, the best we have," Thorne said, looking at the old man being carried away. "The absolute best." The climax ended not with a bang, but with a procession. The tank sat silent in the lobby, a smoking monument to the violence of the day. But the man who had tamed it was leaving. And this time, nobody was laughing at his shaking hands. They were just praying they would never have to face them. The sterile, white silence of the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center Recovery Suite was a jarring, almost violent contrast to the cacophony of turbine engines, shattering glass, and screaming metal that had defined the last 48 hours of Master Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Graves' life. And as the old man lay in the crisp hospital sheets, staring up at the acoustic tiles of the ceiling with eyes that were bruised and weary but still fiercely alive, he felt the heavy, suffocating blanket of peace settling over him. A sensation he had spent 50 years running from, usually by burying himself in the noise of engines and the smell of grease. Outside the heavy oak door of his VIP suite, the world was in a frenzy. The news cycle was spinning uncontrollably, trying to reconcile the blurry smartphone footage of a World War II tank smashing through a glass lobby with the official Department of Defense press release that described the event as a highly classified joint force counterterrorism training exercise involving legacy assets. The narrative was thin, a frantic patchwork of redactions and half-truths constructed by Agent Thorne and General Mitchell to keep Graves out of federal prison and the nuclear protocols out of the public eye. But inside the room, the truth was sitting in a leather chair in the corner, wearing a dress uniform with 3 stars on the shoulder. General Mitchell watched his old mentor breathe, the rhythmic whoosh-hiss of the oxygen concentrator measuring out the seconds, and he saw not the invincible wraith of the history books, but a man made of scar tissue and stubbornness who had just used the last of his fuel to light a fire one more time. Graves shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at the 22 stitches running down his side and the fractured ribs that made every inhale a negotiation with pain. He turned his head slowly, the tremors in his hands visible even as they rested on the blanket, vibrating with that familiar, constant frequency. "Stop staring at me, Jimmy," Graves rasped, his voice rougher than usual, stripped of the adrenaline that had carried him through the fight. "I'm not a statue, and I'm not dead yet." Mitchell smiled, a tired expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'm not staring, Gunny, I'm guarding." Thorne is downstairs with a team of lawyers trying to figure out how to classify a tank round destroying a server room as administrative restructuring. He wants to give you a medal. The president wants to give you a medal. Hell, Sentinel Dynamics probably wants to sue you and give you a job at the same time. Graves snorted, a sound that turned into a cough. I don't want a medal. I want my truck keys, and I want to know if they fixed the lawn at the museum. I tore up the colonel's grass pretty good. It was classic Graves, deflecting the glory, focusing on the mundane, grounding the extraordinary in the dirt of the everyday. But the door opened then, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from the camaraderie of old soldiers to something far more fragile and profound. Colonel Reynolds walked in, his arm in a sling from the crash, followed closely by Sergeant Kowalski and Corporal Mendez. The three men who had been the bullies, the doubters, the ones who had yelled at the confused tourists to get back behind the rope, now stood at the foot of the bed with their covers in their hands, looking like children entering a cathedral. They were washed, scrubbed of the soot and blood, but their eyes still held the thousand-yard stare of men who had seen the elephant. Reynolds stepped forward, his posture rigid, struggling to maintain his composure. "Sir," Reynolds said, his voice thick, we wanted to check on the patient and the tank." Graves looked at them, his gaze softening. He saw the change in them. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the white phosphorus smoke and the reality of combat. In its place was humility, the fertile soil where wisdom could finally grow. "The patient is ugly but functional," Graves muttered. "How is the tank? How is Alice?" Kowalski swallowed hard, stepping up beside the colonel. She's rough, sir. The rear engine deck is gone. Suspension is blown on the number 4 road wheel. The turret ring is cracked from the blast, but the mechanics... They say the engine block is intact. The Ford V8, it survived." Graves nodded slowly, closing his eyes. "Cast iron," he whispered. "They don't make 'em like that anymore. She took the hit so we didn't have to." Kowalski hesitated, his fingers fumbling with something in his pocket. He looked at the general, asking for permission with his eyes, and Mitchell nodded imperceptibly. The young sergeant took a step closer to the bed, his presence looming over the frail figure of the old man, but the dynamic was completely inverted from their first meeting. Kowalski looked small, and Graves looked like a giant resting. "Sir," Kowalski started, his voice cracking. "My grandfather, Stanley, you said you were with him." Graves opened his eyes. The playfulness was gone. The deflection was gone. This was the reckoning. "I was," Graves said softly. "November 29th, 1950, the darkest night of the world." Kowalski pulled a small, battered photograph from his pocket, a black and white image of a smiling young man in a tanker's uniform leaning against a Pershing. He held it out with a trembling hand. "We never knew," Kowalski whispered. "The army just said MIA, missing in action. My grandmother waited for 10 years. She left the porch light on every night until she died. She thought maybe he was captured. Maybe he was lost." Graves looked at the photo, and a tear leaked from his eye, tracking through the wrinkles of his cheek. He reached out with his shaking hand and took the photo. The tremors were violent, blurring the image, but he stared at it with an intensity that bridged decades. "He wasn't lost, son," Graves said, his voice gaining a sudden, resonant strength. "He knew exactly where he was. We were the rearguard, Task Force Faith. The Chinese hit us with 3 divisions. It was 30 below zero. The fluid in the recoil cylinders froze. The machine guns jammed, but the engine kept running because Stanley wouldn't let it die." Graves looked up at Kowalski, locking eyes with the grandson of his ghost. "We took a hit to the track. We were immobilized. The infantry was pulling back. We had orders to spike the gun and abandon the vehicle. But we had wounded on the back deck. 12 guys, infantry, frozen, bleeding. If we left the tank, they died. If we stayed, we died." Graves paused, his breath hitching. Stanley looked at me. He smiled, that same smile in this picture. He said, "Tom, you drive. You get these boys out. I'll load. We'll turn the turret to the rear and fight our way backwards." And we did, for 3 miles. He loaded that 90 by hand, slapping the breech, screaming targets. He kept the Chinese heads down while I drove blind, steering by the stars and the muzzle flashes. The room was dead silent. Even the general was looking at the floor. "Made it to the pass," Graves continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But a mortar round hit the cupola. I took shrapnel. Stanley took the blast." He slumped over the breech. He looked at me and he handed me his St. Christopher medal. He said, "Tell Mary I'm not cold." And then he was gone. Graves reached into the collar of his hospital gown and pulled out a silver chain. Hanging from it was a worn, tarnished medal, the same one Kowalski had heard about in family legend. "I've worn it for 70 years, Graves wept. "I was waiting to give it back. I couldn't find the courage to tell her." He held the medal out to Kowalski. "It belongs to you now, son. He wasn't missing. He was right there, saving us all." Kowalski broke. The big, stoic sergeant dropped to his knees beside the bed, burying his face in the sheets, sobbing with a grief that had been deferred for 2 generations. Reynolds placed a hand on his sergeant's shoulder, tears streaming down his own face. It was a moment of profound, sacred release. The bully who had mocked the old man was dead. In his place was a man who understood the lineage of his own blood. Graves reached out and placed his shaking hand on Kowalski's head, a benediction from the past. "Don't cry for him," Graves whispered. "He did his job, now you do yours." After a long moment, Kowalski stood up, wiping his face, clutching the medal and the photo. He looked at Graves with a reverence that was absolute. "I will, sir. I promise I'll never yell at a tourist again." Graves chuckled, the tension breaking. "You can yell at them if they touch the paint. Just check their hands first. If they shake, offer them a coffee." Reynolds stepped forward then. "Sir," the colonel said, "the drone, the investigation. Thorne tells me the microchip tracked back to a subsidiary shell company. Vance is singing like a canary. He's giving up names, senators, contractors. You exposed a rot that went all the way to the bone." Graves shrugged. "Rot always stinks if you let it sit. I just opened the window." Reynolds looked at the floor, then at Graves. "You saved my career, Gunny. You saved my command, and I treated you like garbage." "You treated me like a liability," Graves corrected. "Because that's what I looked like. That's the lesson, Colonel. War doesn't look like a poster. It looks like a dirty shirt and a broken man. You were looking for a soldier in a uniform. You forgot that the uniform is just cloth. The soldier is the thing inside." Reynolds nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "I won't forget again, and sir, about the tank, Alice." "Yeah, we're restoring her," Reynolds said firmly. "Not as a museum piece, as a memorial, and we want to rename the exhibition hall the Thomas Graves Center for Armor History." Graves shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. No names, no statues." "But sir—" "No," Graves said, his voice hard. "You want to honor me? You keep that tank running. You keep the oil fresh. You keep the batteries charged, and you leave the dent in the transmission housing. Don't bondo it. Don't paint over it. That dent is the story. You paint over the scars, you erase the truth." He looked at Mendez, the young corporal who had driven the tank through hell. "And you, Corporal, you kept your foot in it when I told you to. You have good instincts, but you need to learn to listen to the engine. She was screaming at you in second gear." Mendez beamed, standing taller than he ever had. "I'll learn, sir. I'll listen." 3 weeks later, the air at the National Armor Museum was cool and crisp, the oppressive heat wave having broken with the passing of the summer storms, leaving the sky a brilliant, polished blue. The crowds were back, larger than ever, drawn by the viral fame of the tank incident, though few knew the full truth of what had happened. They came to see the tank that had fought a drone. They came to see the scars. And there she was, Alice, sitting on a new concrete pad in the center of the parade ground, her rear engine deck repaired with fresh steel that hadn't yet been painted to match the faded olive drab, a deliberate scar that told a new chapter of her history. The Legends of Steel exhibition was reopening, and the VIP stand was full again, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was no impatience, no arrogance. The active-duty crews moved with a quiet, professional precision, checking their vehicles with a thoroughness that bordered on religious devotion. Staff Sergeant Kowalski stood on the back deck of his M1A2 Abrams, watching the crowd, his hand absent-mindedly touching the St. Christopher medal that now hung around his neck. He wasn't screaming at his crew, he was teaching them. "Listen to the idle," Kowalski was saying to a young private. "Hear that ticking? That's a loose injector. Don't ignore it. It's talking to you." Near the rope line, the crowd parted as a golf cart drove up, driven by Colonel Reynolds. In the passenger seat sat Thomas Graves, wearing a fresh red flannel shirt and clean blue jeans, his baseball cap pulled low. He looked frail, his walk a bit slower as he climbed out of the cart, favoring his bandaged side, but his hands were still shaking. And for the first time, he didn't try to hide them in his pockets. He let them shake. He walked up to the rope, the same yellow rope where he had been yelled at, and stood there looking at Alice. A hush fell over the crowd near him. They recognized him. The whispers started. "That's him! That's the guy! That's the ghost!" A young mother pushed her little boy forward, a child holding a plastic toy tank. "Go ahead," she whispered. The boy walked up to the rope and looked up at Graves with wide eyes. "Mister," the boy asked, "are you a tanker?" Graves looked down, his blue eyes twinkling. He crouched down, wincing slightly until he was eye level with the kid. He reached out a shaking hand and touched the plastic tank. "I used to be, son," Graves whispered. "Now I'm just a mechanic." "Why do your hands shake?" the boy asked with the innocent bluntness of childhood. The mother gasped, stepping forward to apologize, but Graves held up a hand. He looked at his trembling fingers, then at the boy. "My hands shake," Graves said, his voice loud enough for Kowalski and Reynolds and the nearby crowd to hear, "because they are full of memories, and memories are heavy things to carry. If you don't hold them tight, they float away, so I hold them tight, and the shaking, that's just the engine idling." The boy nodded, accepting the logic. "Cool," the boy said, "like a tank." "Exactly," Graves smiled. "Like a tank." General Mitchell stepped up to the microphone on the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general's voice boomed, Today we honor the history of armor, but history is not just steel and iron. History is blood. History is decisions made in the cold and in the dark. We are joined today by a man who reminds us that the spirit of the American soldier does not retire. It does not fade. It waits. Mitchell pointed to Graves. Master Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Graves, the floor is yours. The crowd erupted. A standing ovation that rolled across the parade ground like thunder. Graves stood there, uncomfortable, looking at his boots. He didn't want a speech. He didn't want applause. He just wanted to hear the engine. He looked at Kowalski on the Abrams. He nodded. Kowalski understood. The sergeant dropped into his hatch. "Fire it up!" Kowalski yelled. The turbine whined. Then the diesel engines of the Sherman started. Then the Patton. And finally, with a roar that shook the earth, Mendez hit the starter on Alice. The Ford V8 caught instantly. No hesitation, no smoke, just a clean, powerful bellow. The symphony of steel filled the air. Graves closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, letting the vibration sink with the tremors in his hands until they felt like one and the same. He wasn't shaking anymore. He was resonating. He turned to Colonel Reynolds, who was standing beside him at attention. "She sounds good, Colonel," Graves shouted over the noise. "She sounds ready." Reynolds smiled. "She is, sir, and so are we. We have a permanent pass for you, Gunny. Gate access anytime, day or night. You come check on her whenever you want." Graves adjusted his cap. "I might do that, just to make sure you boys aren't flooding the Cobb." He turned to walk away, heading back toward the parking lot where his rusted Ford truck waited. He walked slowly, his shadow long on the grass. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the tank was in good hands. He knew the legacy was safe. The confused tourist had done his job. He had started the engine. He had stopped the war. And he had reminded a generation of high-tech warriors that the most advanced weapon system on Earth is and always will be the human heart. As he reached his truck, he paused and looked at his hands one last time. They were still shaking. But as he gripped the steering wheel, he realized something he hadn't felt in 50 years. They weren't shaking from fear. They weren't shaking from trauma. They were shaking because they were still alive, and that was enough. He turned the key and his own engine roared to life, a harmony to the chorus of tanks behind him. The Ghost drove out of the gate, merging into traffic, just another old man in a red shirt, invisible once again, but leaving behind a world that would never dare to look through him again. The lesson was carved into the steel of the tank and the souls of the men who drove them. Respect the rust. Because under the rust, the steel is real, and under the shaking hands, the aim is true.